And this is a puzzle. One of the things we'll find is the Gospel of John likes puzzles. He likes riddles. So what does this mean when Jesus talks about the Son of Man being lifted up? Does it mean his ascension into heaven? Does it mean his resurrection from the dead? Does it mean his being put on a cross? Because when you nailed somebody on a cross, you did it on the ground and then you put them up like this. So does the lifting up of the Son of Man refer to his crucifixion, or his resurrection, or his ascension, going back to the Father? It's a puzzle. We're never told exactly. And that's one of the wonderful things about this text is that it plays with you all the time. It wants you to wonder about what's being meant here. And then one of the other points is signs. What are signs in the Gospel of John? In the other Gospels, they talk about Jesus' miracles, his healings, but a term preferred by this Gospel writer is sign. For example, turning water into wine. Jesus is famous for turning water into wine, one of his major miracles. It's only in the Gospel of John. It's not in the other Gospels. So some of Jesus' famous miracles are in the Gospel of John, but they're not called miracles in John. They're called signs. So look at 2:11. Jesus did this, the first of his signs, this is the turning the water into the wine, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and the disciples believed in him. Notice, the first of his signs. Let's look over a little bit. 4:54. Now this was the second sign that Jesus did after coming from Judea to Galilee. The second sign. This has actually led some scholars to say that one of the sources this writer may have had is a signs book, a collection of signs, that is, miracles that Jesus did. But notice, they're not just a miracle that Jesus does and then casts off. I think that the author uses the term sign because most of the time you can actually do an exegesis of these signs narratives, and they have some kind of symbolic meaning. So the signs in Gospel of John are not just miracles to prove Jesus' power. They seem to have some kind of theological or symbolic meaning embedded into them also. But one of the most important things that drives the Gospel of John is sectarianism. A sect is a sociological term that refers to any group, whether it's religious or not, although we usually tend to use this in religious context, that considers itself very well cut off from the rest of society. So, for example, I grew up in a very, very sectarian fundamentalist church in Texas. By sectarian, I mean that we basically believed that we in my church were the only ones going to heaven. So in fact, we would call each other brother or sister. And you wouldn't even call a Baptist. I mean, we thought the Southern Baptists were going to hell. What made this group a sectarian group was we had very firm boundaries. There were debates about whether it was okay to marry outside of that boundary. Could you actually marry a Methodist? Oh, God, no. And God help you, a Roman Catholic. The stronger the walls between your group and outsiders, the more sectarian your social group is. John's church seems to be a very sectarian group. And that's one of the things why does he talk so much about dark and light? These are stark divisions, insiders, outsiders, up, below. There are children of light and children of darkness. There are children of God and children of Satan. There's no in-between. There's no gray area. You're either in or you're out. So scholars define this by talking about Johannine sectarianism, the insider-outsider divisions. And we're going to look at one place where that comes up. Look at chapter 9. I'm going to spend a little more time with this chapter because some scholars have used this to say what's going on in the Gospel of John. So get chapter 9. Get your Bibles out. This is a story about Jesus healing a man born blind. By the time you get to verse 13, what started out as simply a healing story, although it may have had symbolic meaning because the man's blind and he comes to see, and those are big important themes for the Gospel of John, now it becomes a conflict story over the Sabbath. So he tells the story again to the Pharisees in verse 17. So they said again to the blind man, this is the Pharisees, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened. He said he is a prophet." Okay, so that's important. The Jews did not believe, this is verse 18, that he had been born blind, they received his sight, until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked him, is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he see? His parents said, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind. We do not know how it is that he now sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age, he'll speak for himself. His parents said this is the narrator speaking now. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. Now, wait a minute. All the people in this story are Jews. Jesus is a Jew. The blind man's a Jew. His parents are Jews. They're all Jews. Why are we talking about some people being afraid of the Jews? For the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Now, I hate to tell you, folks, but that's just outright anachronistic. There was no movement going on during the life of Jesus where anybody that confessed anybody to be a synagogue would be excommunicated, Jesus to be the Messiah, would be excommunicated from the synagogue. That just didn't happen. It just wasn't going on. Now, it may have been going on decades later when this guy wrote the gospel, you see. So now, we'll keep reading. What's going on here, of course, is what you believe about Jesus the Messiah has to do with whether you will be allowed to stay in the synagogue. If you take Jesus to be just a prophet, you might be allowed to stay. If you confess that he's the Messiah, you'll be kicked out of the synagogue. That's the basic conflict of the story. The blind man is sort of like someone who comes to faith in Jesus as the Messiah, and he recognizes it. But sure enough, if he really confesses that, he's going to be thrown out of the synagogue. And so he leaves the synagogue and he joins up with Jesus. He's thrown out of the synagogue, he becomes a disciple of Jesus. In other words, allegorically speaking, he has to leave the synagogue and therefore he becomes a member of John's church. There are other people who suspect that Jesus may well be the Messiah. They want to confess him and they don't do so because they're afraid about being excommunicated from the synagogue. Notice how this story has become an allegory for what's going on in the time of the writing of the piece itself. Look at 5:18, right before that. For this reason the Jews were seeking For this reason the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but was also calling God his own Father. Now that's so far where you've gotten in the narrative, but notice what the author adds right after that, the next very phrase. Thereby making himself equal to God. Is every son always equal to a father? Go like this. No. All sons are not equal to all fathers. The gospel writer is editorializing because this is what he believes. He believes that not only is Jesus God's son in some kind of derivative sense, he believes that by saying that Jesus is God's son, he's actually equal to God the Father. And look at 8:58. We're going to come back and talk about chapter 8 next time. There's this, chapter 8 is one of these classic scenes in the Gospel of John, which start out with Jesus just talking to someone in what seems to be a cordial and relatively peaceful mood. And then as the conversation goes on, things get more and more heated. And people accuse Jesus of things, but Jesus is just as bad. He accuses people of stuff all the time. Ridiculous stuff sometimes. Like they're children of Satan. And the whole thing ends up with this big division. And everybody's starting to throw things at each other. And then the next chapter will start, and you'll see them talking again. And again, it comes down to a big division. So this is the end of chapter 8, which is one of these scenes of a discussion turning into a fight, turning into a brawl, turning into a division. And where does it end? Verse 58, chapter 8, Jesus said to them, "Very truly, I tell you, before Abraham was, I am." So they picked up stones to throw at him. Isn't that interesting? All he has to say is, I am. Why is that so much of a problem? Where does I am come from? Yes? That's the declaration of what God is when God says, I am, to whom and where in the Bible? Moses in front of the burning bush. Exactly. The very name of God, which those of us who are non-Jewish, we usually say is Yahweh. There are only 4 letters, right, in Hebrew. And those 4 letters don't have vowels attached to them. So we're not really sure how to pronounce them. But according to pious Jewish usage, you never pronounce those. So you would say something like the Lord as a substitute. And that's the way in the Greek Bible it does. Since the Greek Bible didn't know what the name was, it just would say Adonai or the Lord or something like that. And so we use that in English translation. But the scholars think that perhaps the best translation for those 4 letters as they occur in Exodus is beingness, or I am. Notice what Jesus is saying. He's claiming to be the one who spoke to Moses out of the bush. That's radical. That's way more radical than anything we've seen in the other Gospels. Jesus could be the Son of God and still not be God. Jesus could be the Son of the Father and still not be equal to the Father. Jesus could be the Messiah and still not be divine. And Jesus could be even the Messiah and divine and still not be I am. In the Gospel of John, nuh-uh. Jesus is I am. He's the one who spoke to Moses. It's no wonder that the Jews tried to stone him. We'll talk about that further next time.